My great-grandfather, Alexander Andrews Marks, was born in 1909. He attended Sidney Lanier High School, then a predominantly white high school, now a predominantly African American one, and graduated from Mercerburg Boarding School. He attended Princeton University for his undergraduate and Harvard Law for his law degree. He was elected as the judge for the Montgomery Court of Common Pleas and served for 28 years, from 1948 to 1976. He was often remembered as being a fair judge who, quote, believed that the law should be equal for all despite the color of their skin, unquote. Between 1956 to 1957, my great-grandfather was the judge for a trial in which Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was called to the stand, and my grandmother, Frances Marks Bruton, who was around 16 or 17 at the time, remembers being encouraged to skip school. 1956 and 1957 were a very important time for the civil rights movement and for the recognition of Martin Luther King. The Montgomery bus boycott, which lasted from 1955 to 1956, was intensely endorsed by King. He was asked to be a keynote speaker on the subject a day after the boycott began.
The keynote speaker at Holt Street Church was a new preacher in town, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He was only 26 and was almost unknown outside his own congregation. King wasn't sure he should accept when his fellow ministers and other leaders asked him to head the new Montgomery Improvement Association and the boycott. But they wanted him in part because he was new in Montgomery.
We, the disinherited of this land, we who have been oppressed so long, are tired of going through the long night of captivity. And now we are reaching out for the daybreak of freedom and justice and equality. The only weapon that we have in our hands this evening is the weapon of protest. That's all.
The SCLC, or the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, was also led by King and started in 1957. At this point, he was still considered the minister of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church before moving to Atlanta, Georgia, and starting his more famous preaching career. In this following interview, I will be asking my grandmother about the experience, but the main focus of this conversation is how this event changed her, and if seeing Dr. Martin Luther King in person, or my great-grandfather's opinions, affected how she carries herself today.
But Sophia, the experience of going to court when Martin Luther King was a witness was impressed, has made a lifelong impression on me. The case had to do with something to do with the Light and Power Company, the Power Company of Alabama. And I think it was because African Americans were being denied jobs at the power company. And there had been some kind of sabotage. I don't know quite what it was, but like some small bomb had been set off. And it had to do with the African Americans wanting jobs, which they were being denied.
Right.
And my father, your great-grandfather, was the judge of the Court of Common Pleas in Montgomery, Alabama. This was in 1956 or 57, and I was about your age. I was 16 or 17 at the time, and I my father told me to skip school and come to court that day, and he'd never done that. That was not so, and I didn't skip school. And I believe it was in February or March. Martin Luther King was the young minister of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, and it was before he had become the nationally and internationally known figure that he became later. He was still a young man in Montgomery, and clearly he had a lot of influence. And he came to as a witness, I think like a character witness at this trial. But it wasn't more a trial, it was really more a hearing. And what I remember primarily was Martin Luther King's incredible dignity and composure, and the way the lawyer for the other side, I think, tried to rile him or tried to annoy him, because the lawyer showed such lack of respect, and the contrast between the lawyer, who was named Hill, of a very prominent political family in Alabama. That one of the senators at the time was Mr. Hill. The contrast between Martin Luther King's dignity and eloquence and composure and the lawyer, Mr. Hill's, kind of, I don't know, talking down to dis, condescension toward Martin Luther King made a really, really, really big impression on me all my life.
Wow.
And it was a very important day for me.
To go over great-granddaddy, you said originally that great-granddaddy was pretty liberal on his feelings and understanding that. And what'd you say? Yeah, you can talk more about that if you'd like.
Well, my sister and I grew up with a great deal of pride in our father because he expressed the fact that civil rights was what had to happen. And as a lawyer and as a judge, he believed very strongly in the rule of law and that everyone should be treated equally before the law. And he found it I imagine that it was kind of a crisis of conscience. On the other hand, he grew up in a very totally segregated society. I grew up in a totally segregated society. And so these were ideals that we believed in, but we didn't, I didn't, and he didn't, for instance, participate in any kind of protests or any of that. But I think that he believed very deeply in equality before the law.
Right. And do you think that affected, like, his views affected your views in any way? Like, do you think his influence made a difference?
Oh, yes, for sure. I mean, as your grandfather says, I'm a yellow dog Democrat because I believe that the Democrats are much more likely. I get that from my father and my mother, and my Aunt Julia.
Right.
Of course, it makes a difference that I haven't lived in the United States for continual periods of time for a long time.
Do you think that made a difference, like moving to Mexico at such like a prominent time for civil rights, especially in Montgomery?
Yes, because I've often wondered if I would have participated actively in person in some of these things, because I admire the people who did, but I wonder if I would have had the courage to do so. I don't know.
Wow.
My grandma graduated high school in 1958, went to Duke, met my grandfather, and got married at the age of 20. They moved to Mexico City in 1960 and had their first child, my Uncle Alex, before the March on Washington in 1963. I never really got to know my great-grandfather. He died in 2009 when I was 9 years old, 2 months before his 100th birthday. All I can really remember about him is his love for world maps and his tendency to turn his hearing aid up a little too much so that he thought that we were all screaming. Overall, I learned a lot throughout this project. Not only did I learn about the beginning of the civil rights movement, but I learned about the importance of treating everyone as equals and how one event or person can really alter your views and opinions for the rest of your life.